I'd like to open the third section, namely heritage communication, a translator wanted. I'll give the floor to Professor Rimvydas Laužikas. Well, I thought I should bring my coffee with me because it's allowed to remove the mask when you are eating. Hello to everybody, both present in this conference room and watching us online. I'd like to introduce three speakers. Unfortunately, our colleague Mindaugas Ardišauskas fell ill. Nevertheless, Associated Professor Dr. Zinaida Manžuch and Nideta Jarockienė are here. Our topic is heritage communication. In terms of heritage, the communication constituent is underestimated. In my view, our relationship to heritage is either through memory or through communication. In terms of memory, it is mostly inherent in science and in the relationship, in personal relationship. I trust it can be expressed through the persons I trust. For example, my family, my parents and grandparents. In this way, heritage can be inbuilt in my memory. But there are many generations, and eventually younger generations no longer remember heritage. We can preserve it through communication. It can be opposition-based communication or a different one. In any case, we need a translator. A personal relationship means personal translation. To be able to do so, I need many skills or to be a scholar. Once you look at the painting, you read an old manuscript, you should know at least the Latin language or some other languages. For this reason, we are unable to translate for ourselves. A scholar, a researcher plays this role for us. Here we encounter one more problem. A scholarly text is specific and not everybody can read and understand it. Eventually, we need an extra translator. And it can be a professional, a museum employee, a journalist, or a specialist of culture who takes an object of heritage, translates all this information into an understandable language, just leads a tour or leads some other activity. So, our relationship to cultural heritage has been formed by some communication professionals. We get some heritage through our memory, and the rest has been formed by outsiders, by professionals or translators. Their role is huge. At times, their role is underestimated, but it's a topic to be discussed. That's why we are going to talk about the power of communication and the role of translator. And we need also a skill to be able to perceive what we get has already been translated by someone. And I'd like to invite you to be active. The success of all sessions and the joy depends on the level of our activity. Now I'd like to give the floor to Zinaida Manžuch. and her presentation about societies, communities, and heritage, ethnical issues of communication. Dear colleagues, I hope you will allow me to remove my mask. Speaking and wearing the mask would be complicated. I'd like to say hello to all of you, both present in the room and watching us online. Yes, indeed, it'll be the translator's need and miscommunication in communication. I will try to reveal it through ethical problems which are very intensively discussed. Cultural heritage can be known and used. It is a very important premise and a prerequisite for us to understand who we are, for us to be able to improve and learn. An object of cultural heritage has a certain form, expression, and can be known. It is formed in different contexts. For communication to take place, several preconditions are necessary. Those preconditions have been laid down in international instruments, for example, in UN conventions. For cultural heritage communication to take place, each person needs access to heritage assets. Individuals should enjoy equality to be able to use it. There are numerous opportunities, including online one, but there are also obstacles. Our communities are not homogeneous. That's why I called my presentation, I included the element of communities in my presentation. Our societies consist of a large number of communities, each having different stories. We must admit their existence because it defines heritage communication. It is underpinned by recognition of variety. It depends on our attitude to diversity. All those principles also apply in the areas where most misconfusion surfaces out. Ethics or morals or right things can be defined differently. Different approach can be identified. Cultural authorities include ethics into their commitments. I will invoke the concept of human rights as reflected in my previous slide. The concept of human rights states that all individuals, irrespective of their status or origin, enjoy the same fundamental rights as discussed before. The presence of rights also implies obligations. For a right to be exercised, somebody else should perform an obligation. Ethical conflicts and misunderstandings take place when rights and obligations clash. Cultural heritage communication, as mentioned by Rimvydas, involves a large number of players. It would be difficult to speak about each of such players. I will only speak about communication from the side of the so-called memory institutions. Archives, libraries, and museums are the only authorities in the world who have been delegated the function of communication of heritage. They are not the only institutions in this area. but the only institutions who have been specifically delegated this role. I will try to highlight a couple of issues in order to open up discussions. In general, there are many issues and many more issues. If you are willing to explore such issues in greater detail, you can look up my articles, my publications. And today, because of the shortage of time, a broader presentation will not be possible. At the start of any discussion of ethnical problems, we should find out what heritage means and how it can be communicated. In terms of definitions, as you know, they consist of long lists of different forms and so on. It is considered equivalent to valuable objects. It's not very helpful for a deeper understanding of cultural assets. Why is cultural heritage so important? It is because it helps the person to look into the past and use the knowledge of the past in order to memorize and satisfy present-day needs. The role of memory has been underlined in many pieces of research. The process of memory and remembrance is a mental process. Everything takes place in our head. There are many discussions about global or collective memory, but it's very wise to remember that all processes take place inside of our heads. Importantly, the process is impacted by different processes. Mr. Halbeck speaks about a social framework which defines what we remember. What we remember is predetermined by the context we live in. On the other hand, what we can remember surpasses our personal experience, as noted by Assmanns in the Cultural and Communicative Memory publications. The latter memory is presented from the side or through the memory of witnesses. Even if witnesses die, cultural assets do not lose their meaning. Cultural heritage as such cannot speak for itself. In order to be able to communicate, it undergoes different transformations. From the perspective of cultural authorities, the first transformation is reliance on professional standards in order to select different fragments of memory for different collections or sets. Interpretation also takes place at this stage. Here, translations come into play. The second stage for heritage transformation is documentation. To be able to use heritage, it must be described, and such systems must exist. Descriptions give a sense to such objects, and it is also predetermined by different contexts. In this stage of interpretation, it might become necessary to call a translator for help. And the tertiary translation is at the stage of presentation of cultural heritage for consumption. For example, in exhibitions, shows, and so on. At this stage, interpretations can be influenced. In this way, through a number of mediators, we can establish a contact with the past. Interestingly, such processes are impacted by modern processes. In today's global world, we are more mobile, we have more opportunities to learn about cultural heritage. We should not disregard digital transformation. Cultural heritage is being expressed and presented through IT, and its scope gets extended. So what about heritage translation issues or problems? If you look at sets or collections, you can describe some as the collections of winners. Marginal communities did not have their own voice, and their experiences were presented one-sidedly. It gave rise to independent archives or community archives. They came into existence when communities could easily use digital instruments. It was very popular among groups who believed they had not been heard by the authorities. So they set up their own archives. Some other part of communications, especially in the countries which had experienced colonial times, had lost their traditional heritage. The scholars submitted and presented a large number of research. Today, you can see a number of sacral symbols, especially of indigenous communities, in on the commercial market. The intellectual property organization carries out the digitalization program of cultural heritage in local communities that should enable those communities to take control of their heritage.
The second stage, documentation. It's a sore point for the staff of memorial institutions, and I'm from the culture where we were taught that information institutions specialists are impartial, and documentation systems or metadata in classical textbooks are defined as data about data. It's something given, and information professional is supposed not to participate in this process, but for several decades the discussions take place that metadata systems are the systems of the viewpoints, and usually these systems are discriminated. And this question became rather acute when it was observed, the features of this discrimination were observed, and for certain cultural communities, the metadata systems were not suitable for documenting their data because they were based on Western documentation principles. And alternative solutions have been developed for several decades. It's an information system intended for communities. It's an open system which was created in 2007, Mukutu, when it means a safe place to store sacred articles. So the system allows decide for the community members which objects will be available and how to describe them. Later, the system and its principles were transferred for documentation of heritage of other communities. And the last thing I would like to point out is the problem of access, which seems very strange in our times, bearing in mind the broad digitalization projects. And one of the examples why people can't still use cultural heritage collections are the so-called displaced archives. These are heritage collections which have been displaced in case of military conflicts or colonization. They were removed to other countries. The displaced archives are not only the object of international treaties on their return, but it's a great problem for archive specialists, librarians, and so on. Because memorial institutions are public institutions, they implement public policy, they are funded from taxpayers' money, and the displaced collections clash with the priorities of the state, and they remain at the margins, and that's why they are disappearing. Today, a digital repatriation solution is offered. It's digitalization of cultural heritage collections in order to bring them back, to return them to communities, and to resolve this conflict. But it causes an even greater conflict because a lot of these collections are available for a fee, and usually in the countries where these communities which created heritage, they lack infrastructure. There are a lot of reports by the researchers of African communities because this research is not available because of the digital gap in Africa. And in cases when these collections are accessible, their interpretation, their documentation in other languages create barriers and a secondary discrimination. So there are a lot of issues related to access. But what conclusions can be made from my brief overview, which, as the shows, points out to certain problems? To my mind, deeper study of cultural heritage communication concept would help to look deeper into the actors in the process and their roles, and some solutions are really available, like the information system, and it should be an inclusive system. Digital technologies do not solve all the problems. Politicians like saying, let's digitalize everything and we will deal with all the issues. Digital technologies provide certain solutions but still reflect the power relations and inequalities in the society. Thank you very much. Let's leave the questions after both presentations. I would like to give the floor to the second speaker, Nideta Jarockienė, Heritage Communication and Interpretation at the Lithuanian Theatre, Music and Cinema Museum, Ideals, Problems and Challenges. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting the Lithuanian Theatre, Music and Cinema Museum to this event, because it's a great opportunity to introduce heritage communication in this particular museum. My presentation will provide a practical approach, what problems exist and how we resolve these problems at the Lithuanian Theatre, Music and Cinema Museum. Please be kindly reminded what Lithuanian Theatre and Music and Cinema Museum is. I would like to remind you that this museum was established in 1926 in Kaunas. Its founder was Sruoga and Mickevičius. It was founded at Kaunas University, and only later on it became part of the Lithuanian theatre up till the 80s of the last century. Later on it was connected to the Lithuanian Museum of Arts, and it became independent only in 1992, and the first headquarter was located in Trakai Street. Nestovsky's palace. And then this palace was taken away from the museum, and the museum with its collections was moved into the smaller Radziwill palace. And the museum is located there at Vilnius Street. The building is very interesting, with an interesting history. The building was constructed in the 17th century. It is believed the architect was Konstantinas Tenkala. In the 18th century, it housed the theatre of Vilnius. It was the center of culture in Vilnius, and a lot of good things happened there. It was the center of culture. Heritage communication at the museum is one of the priority areas in the activities, and I would like to cite Rimvydas Laužikas cites. What's the meaning of preserving something from the past, or if it does not live in the contemporary culture? It's actually the major aim and challenge for our museum. In order to overcome this challenge, in the second half of 2019, 3 main strategic directions were formed, and I would like to introduce them to you. So the first one is the quality of services provided by the museum and increasing of accessibility to the society. The second direction, communication of museum's collections to the public. And the third one, renewal and adaptation of museum infrastructure to the societal needs. I will elaborate more on the first direction, so increasing of quality and accessibility of the services provided by the museum. After the analysis of the museum, and last year the staff of the museum analyzed the activities and how we work, what communication should be like, and we faced a lot of problems here. In 2019, only 26,000 visitors came to the museum. The figure is very low, and we have 16 or 17 exhibitions per year. Temporary exhibitions. We also host different events. We have a lot of educational programs, around 16. They are permanent, and the number of visitors is very low. The majority of visitors are the participants of events and educational programs. It means that there is a very low number of individual visitors, and if we look at who comes to the events and exhibitions, we will see that the average age is 50. These are older people. What we lack are different services aimed at young people. So the main question is, do the products and services created in the museum are suitable for the networking society? And it turned out that the things created at the museum are suitable for the period, which was 30 or 40 years or 50 years ago. However, it does not reflect the modern social context. Another big problem is that the museum is not adapted properly for the needs of the society. We're speaking about an open museum, an accessible museum, or a museum where you can spend your leisure. It's obvious that this is not the kind of museum because we lack recreation places, we don't have a cafe, we don't have a reading room, and people are not eager to spend their free time here. To expand these activities is difficult because of low perception of the importance of these concepts and low investments into the infrastructure. When we identified this problem and decided to solve it, we decided to create innovative educational spaces in the museum, and the project was prepared. We consulted architects and communities, and it was provided to the Lithuanian Council of Culture, but it did not fund this project. And the main reason probably was because they don't realize why it is needed. Why does a museum need a recreation area? Why does a museum need a shop and a cafe? I can show the project that was prepared. It's its part. Our main idea was that we should have a cultural information center in the museum, because the people who come to the museum want this broader cultural information. Families ask, what performance would you recommend for us to see? What performance, what concerts should we go to? And we thought that our museum could become a nice place which would provide information about cultural events, theater, film, and music events, and, for example, buy tickets here. We also planned to equip the museum with a shop, recreation areas, rest areas, and reading room, but we did not receive funding. And the funding of the museum is very low. This project was postponed. Another problem is the assessment of the whole interpretation process. What do I mean by that? Are the topics that are relevant for us, are these topics relevant for society? Because museums usually choose the topics for their events and exhibitions which do not help society to deal with its problems and does not discuss the issues that are relevant to society. When we try to solve this problem related to services, we set some goals. So first of all, we have to get to know the public, audience we communicate with. At the beginning of the next year, we are going to start discussions with our visitors, the program, and we plan to study the needs of our visitors, what they would like, what museum they would like to have, and what services they would need. Already next week, we are planning to start a broad campaign called Let's Create the Museum. We will invite all those who are willing to provide their proposals on events, exhibitions, and projects they would like to implement in the museum. And one more goal, which is rather difficult, is to create a exposition where the phenomena from the past are related to the phenomena from the present, to show the acute problems faced nowadays, and so on. In order to arrange this display, we would like to ask not only people working in the museums, but also professionals and different communities, so that specialists in different areas could create a display which is relevant to modern society. When creating the display in the museums has to answer the question what they would like to tell about, what should the narrative be of the museum. Are we going to speak about the history of the Lithuanian Theatre, Music and Cinema Museum from the most ancient times up to 2020, or we will take another period, or we will speak about the history of the Lithuanian Theatre, Music and Cinema and its past, present and the future, what problems we'll face in the future. Are we going to speak about theatre, music and film and discuss with visitors why theatre, music and film is important for people in general? Or we will speak about theatre, music and film without any context, without showing a global context. And rather complicated process is ahead of us. It is necessary for the museum to create a program of conceptual programs which involves different communities, which will tell what the exhibition should be like to be relevant for them. Another objective is to adapt the museum for different leisure activities, to create spaces and areas in the museum for different activities. And the aim is to provide services that would be relevant for the people representing the networking society. It's important for us to cooperate with education institutions, because we see the trend that when developing educational activities in the museums, museum professionals create them from their perspective, and they focus on the things that are of interest to them. So our aim is to gather a team for discussions that would involve education specialists and to develop the program that would be interesting for the education society. We also have to speak about secondary school students, younger children as well as older, and we have to study what programs would be of interest to them, and when we speak to them, we'll be able to create the program which is interesting and important for students and teachers. It's also important to speak about the use of digital cultural heritage for the creation of products required for the societal needs. The lockout and the pandemic showed that all the services have to be digitalized, and there was the requirement from the Ministry of Culture that it should be done, and we had to decide how to do it. And I'm delighted that we start the project, the virtual gate to the museum. It would be the platform which will help us to introduce the collections of the museum and educational sessions, which will show what we have and what services we provide in our museum.
One more strategical direction is communication of museums events to community. We have an impressive collection consisting of 4,700 exhibits, but the community may access only a small portion. Those exhibits are held in depositories and are used in our Office of various services and products. Zinaida did mention digitization. It is one of priority areas in our museum. Digitization is a highly important area and an open issue. How digitized heritage is used. Most often it seems if you can digitize all pieces, the heritage will be used in one way or another, but the LIMI system has its own problems. Search is difficult, and we promote and encourage virtual exhibitions, but it's not easy to come across such exhibitions on the LIMI system. Their methodology, in my view, is already outdated. So yes, we do digitize our heritage, but the issue hasn't been finalized. Now, in terms of communication of our events, we rely on research. A museum is treated as a research institution, but the research as such is a problematic area in our museum. Cooperation with research and academic institutions is insufficient, and research of the sets stored at the museum will have to be redefined. We'll have to bring it back to life. We must implement the digitization and communication program. We should find out the way forward. We should know what products will be created. We must clearly tell to ourselves that digitized content must be made public through virtual programs, sessions, and publications. The latter are very popular and they are widely used if available. It's equally important to present to a community our treasures stored in our depositories. Open depository program would be important. We hope the updated repository will open access to many people. Updating and rehabilitation of the museum's infrastructure. It is very important because every 3 years the Ministry of Culture carries out a study. The study showed clearly one of the most important restrictions for their access to cultural life was lack of appeal in the relevant agencies and the shortage of supply. Yes, we can create attractive programs, but if the building as such will not be attractive, problems will not be eliminated. Our museum is a unit of a set of buildings. It is used for it is not sufficiently adapted for active museum activities. We feel a shortage to exhibit cultural heritage. the shortage of facilities for active participation. Infrastructure modernization is one of our priority areas. The main idea is to apply holistic, sustainable development concept. And this architecture is smart architecture. The main principle of the method is universal design method. The focus must be on human needs. Museums are visited by people of different age and different generations. The updating of our infrastructure should depend on the possibilities of opening better facilities for different age groups. Here you see administrative building, public space and yard. The slide shows the small palace of Radvilos. Now I will try to present our main ideas. In August, we were informed we have received support for the upgrading of the small Radvilos palace. The support is really very small. It will be impossible for us to create an exceptional museum, and because the support is too small. It is clear early next year we will announce a call for designing services. We will launch discussions how the palace could be adapted for public needs. We'll have to prepare a feasibility study. At the beginning of September, I read a very interesting article on the portal, online portal. Mr. Petrauskas said, our public discusses fiercely about economic and financial matters important for the community, but nobody discusses about creative solutions and applications. In this case, we'd like to see a wide discussion. We'd like to fuel just genuine discourse to make our activities acceptable for our community. It's important to highlight the emotional and symbolic values of the building. Those places or buildings are most appealing, which carry some emotional charge. Symbolic meanings and values should be highlighted, but the first message we'd like to share is that the small palace of Radvilos housed the theater of Vilnius. It was important before the closure of Vilnius University. After the closure, it was the only source of cultural activities. So it opened the era of theaters in the city. It was considered equivalent and followed the suit of the theaters of Moscow and Warsaw. It was a real source of culture in those days, and our museum aspires to become such as well. You see the whole set of our buildings, household building on top on the left. This building is most problematic. It doesn't have any funding right now. It had been joined to another project, but we couldn't secure any financing and it was set aside. We are still in the stage of discussions as to the purpose the building could be used for. Another project we are about to start administrative buildings, the left slide at the bottom. It will be used for modern repositories, conference rooms and centers. We also plan to use the building for the store of the museum and its bookshop. The right bottom slide shows the entrance to the planned museum, cafe and store. The building has its own funding. Such funding is insufficient, so there are many challenges ahead of us if we are willing to set up an activity line we'd like to. So in case we are successful, our museum will be able to present a full panorama and picture of the Lithuanian theater. And our museum will implement its role as the institution in charge of this field. Thank you. Thank you. Nideta, for such a broad picture about the field of museum. Nideta explained to us what's behind the facade of museums. Now we still have some time for discussion and questions. I'd like to ask you to speak into the microphone because of the streaming. Can you hear me? Let's ask from the question session. If you have any questions, just give us a sign. I'll start myself. I'll address my question to Nideta's presentation. It's about one of the trends I noticed around in terms of interpretation and presentation of heritage for community. We speak about several players, about museums and also companies which are commissioned or hired to set up exhibitions or produce some products. Very often tourism information center is the third player. And at times I see museum professionals or heritage professionals tend to step back and to shift responsibility to other parties. In such cases, sometimes products are strange, not because of their technical defects. They are strange because the parties involved are not professionals of the content. An IT professional is not always a professional of cultural heritage. I've seen a map of heritage sites. It pointed to one battle, but the illustration was from a different era. Well, I was even surprised to see such a mismatch. Nideta. What's the relationship between museum professionals and those who win procurements for exposition setups?
Amerikos valstijoje aš esu, man atrodo, kažkaip gal rašiusi ar ten sakiusi apie tai atėjus tokia komandinio ekspozicijos arba parodų,
team exposition or show method has been taken over from the US. So we form a special team, people from museums, other professionals, cinema historians, education professionals, and so on. Such a team works in close cooperation, and the best result is generated from teamwork. Designers or exhibition architects do not have the knowledge about museums or about art research. That's why teamwork is necessary, and it was our choice as well. 1 week ago, I had a personal experience. We delegated one project, namely development of our communication strategy, to one company. We could not do it ourselves because of different reasons, but the efforts failed. It was miscommunication, misunderstanding. We received the product and it was oops. Now we'll have to go back and work on it ourselves. Teamwork indeed is important. People from museums cannot fully set up expositions. They are not behavior experts or communication experts. They need knowledge of how to communicate it to different age groups. Well, the State Knowledge Center is a good example of it. We believe computers will do the miracle, but it was not the case because the senior people are not willing to work on tablets. They prefer video, images, and texts. So we should find a way how to tune it up, and only professionals from different fields make it possible. You mentioned different professionals, theater professionals and cinema professionals. I remember I heard some time ago that microphone, please. Somebody interprets. Researchers and scholars write texts, and there are people who translate the texts. As soon as you get a piece of writing on a complex topic, for example, knowledge of the state or constitutional law, it's a very complex issue, and the translation is not only a technical matter. I'd like to go back to Zinaida's insights. Colonial perception, imposition of power, or efforts to impose your own interpretation at times can be visible in researchers and scholars. The power of knowledge and interpretation is an important tool, especially vis-à-vis other members of the society. Not every individual can undermine scholars' arguments. Ms. Zinaida, how can we overcome such barriers? How to restrict researchers' possibilities to impose his powers and ideas? And we can start from the colonial interpretation, and it was prevalent among scholars in particular. Scholars and researchers do some self-reflection. I was surprised anthropologists who deal with communities were the first to speak about this issue. In their area, perception and interplay of traditional cultures and local communities is very important. It's a good indication for me of self-reflection. I'm a scholar myself. I believe those branches of sciences which deal with heritage must be able to self-reflect. And they were the first. They brought about those issues. They were the first to question metadata systems. Metadata are sacred for librarians, so they believe it's not a matter of interpretation. And I would say we should have hopes about discussions. Discussions will start in time. Maybe it's not today yet. Or maybe it will not happen soon, but the systems we use as examples had been initiated by scholars who worked together with communities, creating and preserving archives.
But these processes are very slow. We have to admit that there won't be another revolution. But I think that it's coded in science, I mean the self-reflection process, and I believe that the science will help to deal with the problems it creates itself. In terms of displays, I would say that museum specialists have to answer the question whether the museum is neutral or is the place of a conflict. Because museum specialists would like to remain in this neutral zone and work with everything which is acknowledged, but there are a lot of problems and the history is not one-sided. So what we choose to be, we will be relevant to society. I truly believe that a museum should be in the conflict zone. It has to discuss the problems that are painful to our society, but it has to raise these issues. Because if there is no response or discussion after an exhibition, so nothing happened, I can tell from my position as a museum specialist or historian, when I go to the exhibition, when I see that the same truths are told, this neutral history, so there is nothing more I can do there. I look at exhibits and I don't learn anything new. There, it's like reading a textbook. So let's take the 30-year history of our statehood, and we can think from all the exhibitions that the history of creation of our statehood, that the path was really nice and smooth, but this is what was not the case. When you start reading books about our Sąjūdis, and we see that the path was rather complicated. We know what happened in the 1989, 1988, and we'll face the same problems today, so the museum should not fair to be in the conflict zone. For example, the Estonian National Museum of History speaks about a young soldier who comes to serve in Estonia after the Second World War in 1949, and his uniform is exhibited. And then they tell about the Russian engineer who comes to live in Estonia and buys Zhiguli. So his story is told along with the story of a young girl which was taken to Siberia, exiled to Siberia. So, if we did this, there would be a lot of opposition, and the story of that soldier would probably be taken away from the museum together with the head of the director of the museum. We speak about the censorship and we had some events dedicated to Jewish composer Heist, and his story is very important. It can cause different discussions about human values which are relevant in our society. But the museum faced great opposition. Can you imagine? The discussions will start, someone will be angry, and some people are still alive. What we will tell these people? The articles will start, and why do we don't need this? So the museum has to be brave, has to speak, and this is the greatest value. Indra, you raised your hand, I haven't forgotten. So this story based on positivism, and we had a study of narratives of Lithuanian and Ukrainian museums together with the colleagues from the history faculty, and the positivism is dominant in Lithuania, and two aspects became clear. This positivist narrative was a very convenient position to avoid criticism. If you tell things that have been confirmed, only facts based on logical figures. If I write that this is the arrow that dates back to the 12th century, it's hard to say that I'm doing something wrong. So it's naked positivism was the form to survive in the Soviet times, but this is also the way for the museum to avoid complicated topics. If we speak about the Holocaust, the most popular thing is to say this in 1941, in June, July or so, the whole Jewish community was killed, and we add just 200,000 people, and we don't elaborate more on the topic, and this position obtains different forms and causes different emotions. I once watched a film which was about small personal revolutions. If large revolutions don't take place in society, small personal revolutions is the only way to stir society, bring some movement into society. We have personal small revolutions in a film, and I think that in the area of museums, these small personal revolutions will soon take place. I would like to add that this aiming at neutrality is not typical only of museums. If we look at the archives, the science of libraries, it's the classical wish to be impartial and neutral, but it's collapsing in all disciplines and practical activities, and it collapses in... It also destroys the role of the archivist, librarian as a specialist. because a new concept of communication is created. The countries which survived colonization, museums collaborate directly with tribes, and the cultural protocols are being created, how to interpret, how to describe these things. But it is a global movement.
Labą dieną, Indrė Laužikaitė-Blaževičienė.
Geriau Indrė Laužikaitė-Blaževičienė.
Tą klausimą su Nideta pasišnekėti. Ir turbūt netgi yra šita problema, kad daugelis muziejų.
There is a problem that the majority of museums think that they should invite someone from a side to help them to choose the right path. It seems that the museum staff should be braver and believe in themselves, because nobody else can know better what your visitors are like. So how these outsiders can know what visitors you have? Are you asking about the communication strategy? We have to work in a team. When they created the the Center of Knowledge about the state, they started with the discussions with visitors. And those working in the museums participate in this interactive process, but they do not have this decisive role. They are not specialists in education. And which specialist in education knows the area of the museum scientists? For example, the theater historian knows well the history of theater. He knows the content, what it is. But this person doesn't know what is needed and how to tell the history of theater to a small child, or a 10-year-old child, or how to tell the history to a 3-year-old. They know this from practice. The researcher, the scientist doesn't know this. If you speak about educators in the museum, they know it, so they are the great specialists. Yes, but not always. I will help Indrė to answer this question. I happened to work in a library, not a museum, and cooperate closely with the libraries. And I can say that in libraries, the consumer need studies are not the strongest point. But all memorial institutions started doing user experience studies, they perform ethnographic studies, they walk around, and we don't have this culture. I have some doubts about our design companies as well in this respect. But these methods have become more popular. And back in 2005, I worked in the European project with the usability of the websites of libraries. These things are not perceived by the museums. The museum specialists understand the content, but they don't have this culture of user experience studies. But abroad, the situation is changing, I should point out. When the display is created, it's tested and you test it with the target group. Small children come watch it, and every study has its name. We were taught these things back in 2000, a professor from Great Britain, and he explained very clearly. And there are a lot of different types of studies. All of us know well what problems are faced by education in museums, and discussions about educations in museums haven't started yet, and we are standing in the same place like we stood in the year 2000, and a lot of discussions are needed. And some negative things have got established in museums because we don't know the purpose of education in museums, why do we need it, and no studies of target groups are performed. There are only few museums which do it, and no training of museum specialists help to deal with this issue. That's why I'm very skeptical about education specialists in museums, although I've been working in this area for the last 20 years. Because it's said that the main thing is to teach. Those who come have to be taught, but the purpose is not to teach. Gediminas, and then you. To my mind, Indrė is speaking about one more thing. What's my relation with the reality, whether I build walls or bridges? I'm a theater historian. I know theater history really well, and I don't know anything else. I'm not going to improve. And for example, I'm primary school teacher. I know how to work with children, but I know nothing about museums. I'm not doing anything. I'm a museum specialist, but I don't know anything about history and children. I'm not going to make another step. And when we have all these three specialists in the same audience who don't want to interpret the experiences in a different context. For example, I teach the Lithuanian language, or I teach mathematics, and I'm not going to do anything else. And the museum professionals, for example, he has a lot of experience with excursions, but he says that I'm not going to dig deeper into the subject of teaching children. And this is not the problem of the professional in the team, but the professional who is ready to build a bridge and to leave the comfort zone and try himself in another area. So this unwillingness to go to a different territory, or the willingness to do it, is decisive in this situation. And you mentioned COVID too. The start of some museums in virtual space was terrible. If they have an excursion for 90 minutes and it's placed on YouTube, so nobody watches video on YouTube for 90 minutes. But some products of YouTube format were created because people realized what YouTube is, so they managed to overcome the barrier or to demolish the wall. And if we think that we can work in other areas. Gediminas Rutkauskas, I have a question and a comment. You've mentioned, speaking about the communication, a certain uncertainty about in terms of communication means, and you speak about the development of infrastructure. So you know how you should communicate, but you actually don't know what to communicate. In fact, you are right, and we have the collection communication program, and we know how we are going to communicate, how we would like to communicate, how we would like to work in this area, and we have defined a lot already. And a brief comment. Since we've spoken about global things, I have some experience from museums. What I've heard here seems very provincial and closed. No other national museum was mentioned where the management, top management was changed, and it seemed that every museum will be closed, they will deal with the problems themselves, and they will find a way out. 2 museums in Poland did something different. The famous Jewish Museum in Warsaw, which prior to its opening communicated in the form of lectures, displays, and educational sessions online several years prior to the opening. So actually you can operate now at full speed and ahead of time by testing. And even if you don't have these premises, and it would be a certain metabolism in architectural terms. And if I know what structure, additional structure I need, I will build it.
Kitas pavyzdys yra tik ką teko būti visiškai net vasaros pradžioje.
One more example. I was in Białystok early in summer. They are getting ready to open a new museum in Białystok. And they are willing to open a museum which has ambitions to be a national level museum. It will speak about exile, the deportations and Holocaust. And it will cover not only their own region, but the whole Russia, Poland, without focusing only on Poland, on national specifics. The museum has been working along this line for a long time. Their management spreads the good experience, and they collect information as well as communicate technically internally, but they are not limited in their own organization. They communicate on a larger scale, on the national scale, plus they cooperate with the Russian archives. They also have some links with the Baltic countries, the Czech Republic and Germany. Regardless of the fact the museum is small of the provincial level. Let me say our developments are similar. Last year we visited Estonian museums for discussions. We met colleagues from Estonia, and we would have done the same if not COVID. We had plans to visit Berlin Cinema Museum to sign an agreement. Maybe it's not so much visible, but we have similar ideas, and it's how we are going to work. will give much attention on internal communication as well, to explain our people where are we moving and how we are going to work. Now, as far as Polish museums are concerned, everybody knows how well advanced they are. We also know about the level of funding of Polish museums, so it is as it is. However, inter-museum communication is very strong and intense in Lithuania. We mutually communicate and exchange information with the newly elected directors of our museums. Well, there are two corners in each stick. As in case of Polin, wide field discussions made the museum dominant in society. Well, I'm not sure if they still have a community. It's no longer seen. We had a joint seminar together with Polin. I can tell they are facing major problems. Those problems are known. The number of visitors is much below the expected visit. They are looking for the answer why it is so. So communication is being developed, and we are going to expand the scope of communication. Victoria, my question would be from a different area. It will be about funding. It has been mentioned a number of times. Today you said you worked out a project, but no funding was allocated. Any vision about entrepreneurship of the museum? In general, I would pass by your yard very often in summer. You have a backyard cafe, and it attracts a large number of people. I believe its activities are profitable. Do you have any vision? How could the museum become more appealing for sponsors? Well, yes, indeed, such services can help us just raise funding. The museum can offer a number of services. Now, in terms of funding, once you try to find funding, you have two options, A and B. In case A fails, if we don't get any money from the Council of Culture, we'll explore some other sources. So, if you have a good idea, in my view, there'll be opportunities to make it work. A practical example, for example, exhibition Singing Revolution. The Council of Culture does not sponsor it, and our partner in this case is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we know we'll get a certain amount of money. You just write a project and try to figure out how it will work. And there are many similar examples. For example, another project about the gateway, it has social partners. Quite many elements will be funded by the social partners. One more example from my side about the British National Archive. It has agreements with major global genealogical services. It just gives access to its collections. The archive prepares packages of information, sellable information, And after 7 years, companies may release the information in 7 years. So this information is accessible only in reading rooms. Business mindset is a matter of discussions on the European level. Memory institutions are public institutions. Digitizations open many opportunities, but such companies must impose certain time limits on accessibility. So there should be the right balance between different aspirations and goals. I'm sorry to intervene for the third time. I'd like to say we are not very honest by saying what museums should do. We can't compare ourselves to Poland. Poland, as the state, has made a decision to develop its own nation. They invest much into new museums. And they also care about their provinces. So provincial or regional museums also get good funding. Are we willing to see our museums as successful commercial companies? No, I don't believe it's the case, because in this case, in such a case, museums will spend fewer of efforts on education or exhibitions. I'm not sure if the Council of Culture is in the position to fund innovations of all museums. We should ask, is our funding, the funding we give as community for museums is adequate? If we are willing to hold discussions in museums, can the museum's director speak in open on painful topics? Can she initiate discussions knowing she must take care of construction or use or reuse of her building? So it's a matter about our potential or disability. So my wish was to speak for museums. Thanks God, the Culture Infrastructure Center will remove the burden off our shoulders. We are happy they are going to take care and maintain our buildings. The burden as such is huge. And I hope the center will successfully do it. Now, in terms of entrance to the market, the law on museums says museums are non-profit seeking institutions, but we feel pressure to earn money. So to go back to our topic, I can say, well, it's very risky to start talking about money and museums. In terms of commercialization, I think it is one of the options. A cafe at a museum is one instrument of communication. Food is close to persons, and food can also reveal many historical and heritage issues. Digital collections. Once we discussed with colleagues from Oslo University, so they are implementing a reconstruction. All sets of the Vikings Museum are being scanned in high resolution by 3D scanner. What opportunities get opened for translation or communication? The communication of 3D projects, be it games, reconstructions, films on history, or so on. So some objects are taken from a special digitized libraries. If you need a Ford model, if you are working on a film, you don't have to find this car on this street. You can simply buy a 3D scan and just paste the model in your film. So I guess it's one of the options to commercialize 3D products of museums. Viking ships and vessels are very popular as such on the international digital space, and the museum has already created its 3D images. They will be offered for creative industry, and the latter will use realistic products matching real vessels by 100%, will be the new reality. And such approach exists. Well, if the creative industry needs to know how spoons or some other utensils looked during Viking times, they will get information from the museum. There are many opportunities to make use of your potential. Yes, commercialization and translation. It's being discussed that digitization of heritage is on high demand. Certain topics are very attractive or can be commercialized. Unlimited commercialization in the area of interpretation will change the meaning. Interpretation will be as handy for somebody. To finalize our discussion, I'd like to say the right balance is very important. There are two cornerstones. The first is to respond by 100% to public needs. Not donors, just the society. But in this case, our interpretation and the field of our interest gets closer to pop culture. And it can be impacted by one-sided visions. But we cannot pretend we are the only ones who know the answer. Good communication and translation of heritage is the middle position. It should cover both ends. I'd like to thank Nideta and Zinaida for their presentations and participation. Thank you for being so active, and see you next time.